Without waiting, the title of the round table is Habitat at the time of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There's no reason why digitization of society should not apply to industry and the habitat as well. I have 5 guests. Dickson, who teaches at Columbia University. He'll be our first speaker. Andrew Heid, no architecture, will speak second. Marion Dutoit, who is a landscape artist. Marie-Christine Premartin from ADEME. She'll talk about ADEME, no doubt. And Olivier, who works in Nantes, if I'm not mistaken. For each speaker, there will be slides. This is a round table where there will be slides. I'd like to give the floor right away to Dickson Despommier. Please. Over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for asking me to give this presentation. What I'm going to describe in 10 minutes is an overview of my view of urban agriculture. And it's in the form of tall buildings inside of which you grow food. And a lot of you may know about this already because I think it's a popular concept even here in France. It's present in a lot of other places, and each one of these little red squares shows you where vertical farming is now a reality. I must tell you that 10 years ago, there were none. So it is a true miracle as to what has happened. The power of education, this happened in a classroom. The idea arose in a classroom. Just as this conference probably started, what can we do to change the world? How can we change it in a way which benefits everybody? And that's what this idea arose from. Not that it's done that yet, but it's on its way. So let me show you a little bit about why we chose to do this. First of all, what is a vertical farm? I can show you one. Here's one about 5 miles away from where I live in New Jersey. This is Newark, New Jersey. So anyone who's flown from Paris to New York and flown into Newark, which is the airport that you fly in mostly, but JFK too, you can see this vertical farm operational today. It's a multi-story greenhouse inside of which you grow food. That means you can grow it anywhere in the world, anytime, for anyone. So why do we have to think about growing our food this way? Because the earth is melting. Do you believe this? Here's the proof. All you have to do is visit these places, and you will see for yourself that the earth is melting. And it will continue to melt. There's a whole issue of Science magazine devoted to that. Every article in this magazine talked about the melting earth. So, okay, why is the earth melting? If the earth is melting, why is that happening? Because the climate's changing. That raises another question. Why is the climate changing? And the climate is changing. We know it's changing because we have the evidence for that too. Again, France is at the leaderboard for that. The IPCC was held in Paris. That's the last one, and this is the evidence that was presented. It's not a belief system, it's a trust system. I trust this data, therefore the earth is melting. And this is why. There are other reasons too, of course, but these are the main reasons why it's melting. We are producing too much of the things that we put into the atmosphere, which slows down the rays of sun and creates a greenhouse out of the earth. And the heat goes up, and the ice goes down. So, what are the effects of climate change on our food production and our water supplies? and our energy and our housing and our health. These are the things that we will talk about. I will talk about food. This is not an atypical shot of what used to be a place where you could grow food. And now you can't, because the climate has changed. So we have to find a new way to do this. And one of the new ways of making food available for everybody, not just a few, but for everybody, is to remove growing food from soil-based technologies. If it's taking place in a building using hydroponics and aeroponics and aquaponics, then anyone can do this anywhere in the world. So what do they look like? This is a real building. It's in Tokyo. This building is called Persona 02. And inside of this building, people work every day figuring out your income tax and your retirement benefits. But when they go to lunch, they don't get served a buffet lunch. They go to the first floor and they pick rice, which is growing inside the building. And then they pick tomatoes, which are growing inside the building. And then they pick green beans, which are growing inside the building. And they take this up to the fourth floor, and the chef prepares their meal. And they have lunch within the same building. Persona 02. Here's another version of a vertical farm. This one's much larger, and this one produces commercial crops for the restaurant industry and the grocery stores. It's one version. There are many versions of this now. Here are two enterprising women in a very affluent society in Jackson, Wyoming. It's a vacation place. It's like going to the Swiss Alps. This building was built on the side of a parking lot. The people that work inside the building, most of them are suffering from genetic disorders like Down's syndrome. And so they've hired those people, which were, before this, totally unemployable, to work inside this building. And their reward is that they get free food. They get to take some of this home to eat, as well as getting paid. Most of the vertical farms are in Japan. And here's a good example. It looks like a hangar of an airplane, but if you go inside, it's loaded with grow systems that go right up to the roof, and they grow for the grocery store industries of Kyoto. This is an experimental vertical farm group at MIT in the Media Lab. They're working out the technologies for the next generation of vertical farms as we speak. And they want this to be open source so that everybody benefits. Even IKEA got involved. They now make hydroponic grow systems that you can have in your home that little kids can use to maybe contribute to the evening meal. How would you like your kid to come home one day and say, I grew this at home. I didn't have to go to a farm. My home is a farm. This is the future of this technology. In Germany today, there's a one-story vertical farm called InFarm, in which they will grow what you ask them to. So your grocery store not only becomes the place where you shop for your food, it's the place where you order your food as well. That's the future. They want their buildings to be 20 stories high. It will democratize the food industry. That's my hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Dickson. Please.
Well, bonjour. Oh, next slide. First slide. I'm Andrew Heid, and I'm an architect and urban designer based in New York. And first off, it's really incredibly humbling and really a great honor to be here. So thank you to the organizers, and thank you to all the people behind the scenes making this possible for us to be here today. So it's really exciting. And I think this topic is really important to all of us, and particularly a kind of really important thing to me. So this talk is fundamentally about housing and habitat in the fourth industrial revolution, but most importantly is the question of how can we live in close proximity together, but how we can continue to do so for generations to come. So this is something I've taught at the graduate level at Columbia and NYIT in New York for the last several years. And this is fundamentally about climate resilient housing. So how can we build houses and cities and in shelter and habitat that can be resilient to climate change at the global level and also climate change at a local level, which is, I'll get to in a minute, but we call that the urban heat island effect. So as a child growing up in Oregon, nature was a really important part of my life. And in Oregon, and particularly in the United States, we have a lot of wilderness areas, a lot of unspoiled nature. And to me, that was always a big draw as a child. But there's an inherent contradiction with that culture. That culture also requires a lot of, let's say, the automobile culture or suburbanization and sprawl that goes with that. So I also live in New York, and as a New Yorker and an urbanist, I know the value and the importance of an ecological, compact, walkable city for ecology, for economy, for creativity. But the question really is, how can we combine those two ideas together? How can we live in an urban society, an urban culture, in close proximity? At the same time, how can we have the experience direct to nature, unspoiled nature and wilderness? And that really was the kind of fundamental catalyst of my office, which is called No Architecture, which was started by asking that question: how can we connect urban life to natural life to get the best of both worlds? And so we focused on building new prototypes of housing and habitat, from the courtyard house to other urban plans to landscape parks, fundamentally asking this question of how can we rethink nature, ecology, and urbanism through innovative architecture? So today we have a really challenging problem on our hands, which of course Dickinson alluded to. The Earth is about 50% urbanized right now in terms of our population. And we've created architecture, or particularly we've created buildings and cities that have high degrees of artificiality. Like this building is heated, and well, it's not really cooled necessarily, but it's certainly heated in the wintertime. That takes a lot of energy. In fact, 70% of the world's energy is consumed in cities. So that's an enormous number. If you thought about it in a different way, if you think about global climate change, 93% of the heat that we've added to this planet over the last 60 years has gone into the oceans. So the oceans are actually at a crisis right now. They're overheating. Had that energy gone into the atmosphere instead, the Earth would be 36 degrees Celsius warmer today than the 20th century average. To put that into perspective, last year, which was the hottest year ever recorded, was 0.9 degrees Celsius warmer, and that's created all kinds of cataclysmic extreme weather events that we've seen in the news over and over again. So imagine all that energy we've actually added to the Earth going into the atmosphere. It would be a totally different planet, probably uninhabitable. So really, buildings and cities are the kind of forefront of that. And architecture is also at the center, in the crosshairs of that. We've created this problem. And so it's a very urgent problem, it's a very challenging problem, but it's also very humbling as an architect, as a profession of architects, to answer, because actually we've created this problem where for the last 200 years, for the previous 3 industrial revolutions, we've created buildings and cities that are incredibly artificial, mechanized. They consume enormous amounts of energy all across different climate zones that are basically ignoring how we used to build in the past. So you can see the kind of international style from the 1960s and later compared to vernacular architecture of previous cultures and contexts and climates. So in fact, in the United States, almost half of our global greenhouse gases are from buildings, are actually produced by the consumption and construction of buildings. 3/4 of electricity in the United States is for buildings. So this is a really, really important problem that we have to address. But that's also at the scale, so that's the global scale. So buildings individually are aggregating to create global problems that we don't really understand. But something that's actually happening in our cities at the scale of a city that's also quite important and also quite challenging for us architects is we've also created this problem. It's called urban heat. Urban heat is an effect where, because of the close proximity of the built-up urban environment, so high-rise towers, freeways, reduction of canopy coverage, concrete, steel, glass. It actually traps the radiant heat of the sun that then re-radiates at night, creating actually a very warm urban environment. In some instances, as high as 9 to 12 degrees Celsius warmer in a local environment. So that's a huge problem, actually, because for every degree Celsius warmer an urban environment is, it increases electrical usage by 4.5% per degree Celsius. It also increases mortality rates by 1.8% for every additional degree you go up. So there's a lot of money that's being wasted a lot of money that's been added to our budgets from electrical consumption for commercial office spaces, houses, because of the rise in temperature and urban heat. So in preparation for this talk, we did some research as an architectural office into how architecture could contribute to positive solutions instead of destructive ones. So one of the first things we looked at and discovered was this concept from climate science called Universal Thermal Climate Index, or U2CI. It sounds very technical, but it's actually incredibly intuitive. It is what connects you as a person in terms of thermal comfort to how the world is kind of organized in climate zones, which is this map. And it's basically the measure of thermal comfort on your body for wind, sun, and humidity. So right now there's no wind in here, so it feels kind of warm. But if you started to turn on a fan, it actually would cool everything down. You can also do that by having sun or not having sun, or changing the humidity. So it turns out in a city like Paris, and this is true for a lot of different cities in the northern hemisphere, if you're standing in the sun in the summertime, you're going to feel, on average, 5 to 9 degrees Celsius warmer, because the sun is hitting you, and that radiant energy is actually warming you, as opposed to if you were standing in the shade, it actually would feel a lot cooler, which is actually an important lesson for architects and all of us to learn, is if it's summertime, you want to stand in the shade. It's going to be a lot cooler. The same is also true with wind, which is something we don't think about as architects or urbanists, but actually urban wind is an incredibly important variable to control the urban climate. So if you're standing in Paris in the wintertime, in the wind, it's going to feel 7 to 8 degrees Celsius cooler because of the wind chill and humidity. So that's actually an important thing to also think about and learn from. Likewise, if you're standing in the summertime without wind, it's going to feel a lot hotter. So why does this matter? Well, this matters because it turns out for thousands of years before the first and second and third industrial revolutions, humans have been building and designing spaces and houses and habitats that actually worked with this at a very fundamental, basic level. And that's what I've called in this research collective form. But another way to think about it is like vernacular housing. And so we actually looked at a survey of vernacular housing from around the world to see and what we could learn from them. So this is an example in China where actually courtyards were excavated into the ground to reduce the heat from the summer. The thermal mass of the earth kept things warm, and also it provided shade. So the idea behind housing in shared spaces and collective form is kind of communal passageways, shared public spaces, reducing the amount of envelope that's exposed to the exterior in courtyards, etc. But this was not, next slide, this was not an isolated discovery, as I mentioned to. This is actually was kind of universal around the world, but different techniques applied. So from the shared walls and communal passageways of North Africa, that looked at, like, this is the Casbah of Algiers, that actually reduced, of course, the solar exposure and made all of the passageways, the public realm, the way you would walk to your work or to school, was always shaded. And also they inserted courtyards, which helped cool the space, which reduced, of course, solar exposure, to the ventilated courtyards or hutongs in Beijing, which was a semi-public private way of connecting interior and exterior space, public and private spaces, which allowed a high degree of natural ventilation that in the summertime, with the hot, humid summers in Beijing, allowed people to have a more cool environment, while in the winter it provided, it could be closed up and provide passive solar heating. To the steppe terraces, there's many examples in the Mediterranean, but this is one in Hydra in Greece, where the topography is actually providing an optimization of solar access and ventilation access, and also shared walls. To an example, and this is an extreme example, but this is an example of Shibam, to connected wind towers in the Gulf region, where they were used actually both for security, but also to allow stack effect heating to cool and ventilate the buildings internally. in addition to self-shading in the kind of public passageways. So wind became really important here. And again, all of these examples are kind of at this kind of cluster scale, this collective form scale. The individual unit aggregates into a larger kind of scale form. So why do we care about this? Well, we care about this for many reasons. So it turns out humans actually have been very intelligent in actually building, through built form, to create habitat, hospitable habitat for the outside and inside without enormous amounts of artificiality, without enormous amounts of energy to heat and cool a space. So these are kind of the examples that we've put together in this report. So what does that look like for the fourth industrial revolution? Well, we can learn from those techniques, and it's a kind of a series of techniques that basically don't use electricity, heating, or cooling. So the first thing we have to do, of course, we have to divest from oil, and that should be very obvious, but the reality of it, currently, our world, our global countries, we subsidize the fossil fuel industry by $5.6 trillion, versus we subsidize renewable energy by $485 billion. So that's got to stop. Like, we're investing and subsidizing the wrong fuel source right now. The next thing we have to think about, of course, is renewable energy. So we have to produce renewable energy at a very large scale, very rapidly. But one thing that's actually very important was connecting those sources globally, or at least connecting the dispersed sources. So this is kind of a renewable energy grid that Buckminster Fuller proposed 60 years ago. The next thing is the scale of development itself. Sustainable development works best at the scale of the cluster or neighborhood. And we learned this from the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Eco-District Protocol from Portland, Oregon, that the best way to make change is the scale of the neighborhood, which we also saw in collective form from these vernacular houses. So the scale of the building is often too small, the scale of the city is often too difficult to implement. Next slide. So what does the shape of this look like? Well, one obvious example is if you take a city like New York, the grid is oriented north-south. Well, that's actually the worst possible way for a city to be. If you rotate that grid 45 degrees, you double the amount of shade. Likewise, canopy coverage is really key, as I mentioned earlier. We can reflect actually 80 to 90% of the heat energy of the sun by just having urban canopy coverage of trees. So that's really critical. Most cities actually have a very little canopy coverage. Photosynthesis and evapotranspiration are also really important. The effect is it can be large, but it's mostly localized. So through transevaporation, we can have quite a bit of cooling, about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. And finally, the last kind of technique that we've distilled out are these ideas of ventilation corridors, where you can actually excavate or create ways for wind to move through a city to actually help cool the city, or in some instances actually block the winter winds. The fabric or the morphology of the city, the degree of roughness, actually also helps stimulate the wind. So that's actually quite important as well. So in conclusion, it's really about connecting community and habitat towards creative form and learning from the last 5,000 years of indigenous techniques and habitats of collective form, clustered housing, vernacular housing, how we can build for the next industrial revolution or the current one without committing the mistakes of the previous three. And for me, architecture is fundamentally about that. It's about understanding how the world was organized in the past, how it's organized in the present, and in order to understand how it can be organized in the future. So at stake for us is figuring out how we can live together in close proximity and how we can do so for generations to come. Merci.
Merci, Andrew. Les solutions à grande échelle.
Thank you, Andrew. Large-scale solutions.
Et la vision d'un artiste paysagiste.
And the vision of an architect and a landscape architect.
On peut passer à la...
Yes, maybe we can now go over to the next slide.
Voilà, je me présente, je m'appelle Marion Dutoit.
I'm Marion Dutoit. I was invited as a local stakeholder. I'm an artist and a landscape architect, and I'm going to present the city to you through a number of projects I carried out in Le Havre with a number of friends. Let's start with this photograph taken between the harbor and the seaside area with a cow and a container ship. This was a performance at the Malraux Museum during an exhibition on Eugène Boudin, an impressionist painter.
The Impressionists are the forefathers of landscape architects because they interpreted the landscape in their own way, which I used to tell you that that's what Le Havre is for me. It's not a very big city, but it has a huge port and nature as a structure within it. I'm going to tell you about Le Havre and introduce you to the city. As you can see, this city with the River Seine on the one hand and the seaside. This is an estuary city. And here you have this green line all through, which are the banks of the River Seine, and which means that there's a lower side and an upper side to Le Havre. Nowadays, 150 hectares of a city that were rebuilt by Auguste Perret, and some of the workers' area that escaped the bombing in 1944. And there's the city on the upper side, which is slightly denser over this green line here, with 2/3 of the population. The harbor is almost bigger than the city. I'm going to tell you about a project I carried out when I arrived here in Le Havre. I got here in 2007. There was an exhibition in the Marion Museum of Le Havre and other cities. It was called Chandigarh, Brasilia, Le Havre. And I was fascinated by this modern city with these square buildings and very open spaces too. So I was thinking all the time that the architect Perret, who had designed this axonometry there, hadn't he had the urgency to rebuild after the war, would maybe have used better the fifth side. That means the roofs in Le Havre. And here we're thinking about a garden on the roof. In 2010, 2011, 12, we started working on a project Under the Sky, the Earth, with an organization called the Rose Burglars, because in 2017 there'll be a great celebration here, and we wanted to have gardens on the roofs of the city. We built 3 gardens. This is one of them. It is very representative of the city of Le Havre. There's a collective dryer at the center of a number of buildings, which is a witness to the fact that Perret had intended people to share spaces. And the context was a bit specific. We didn't know whether the roofs were strong enough, so we created a gardening milieu with a very light substrate, like 39 kilo when it was full of water, but we were working in a dry state, and a number of plants that didn't require much attention because, as I was telling you, the terraces were not built to be accessible to people originally. And here there were 300 windows looking over this space. So it was better for them, we thought, to be looking at a garden than just a conventional roof. Here's a second project. What I want to say is what I like, maybe I've said it already, but what I like in this part of the city built by Perret are the open spaces, which enable us to lead a quality of life. And I'm sorry, there are so many cars, and there's so many parking spaces, and too much tar and not enough greenery. I worked in another area, that's the Danton area around the station, or close to the station. This project is a project for a neighborhood. This is the garden in a nursery school. There was a fairly virtuous process, asking people about what they thought. It's probably one of the first such experience in Le Havre. A prison was demolished, and we had to think about what we were going to do with this area. We took the garden. which and between the street and the school, which you can see on this slide. I work in the garden here with children between the age of 4 and 6, and their parents. Their parents live in this neighborhood, and they grow plants in this garden. In the first 2 years, we'd go there very often. Now there are safety instructions because of the attacks that limit us in what we can do, and we cannot work there as we would like to. 4 to 6 years of age, that's not a lot to be working in a garden. We didn't have many means, and so since we didn't want to have to use a lawnmower, we got a goat. Bibi the goat came at the beginning of March and ate up the grass, and I realized how excited the kids were about such a common animal as a goat. And everybody would stop in the street to look at the garden, but what frightened me most was to hear children saying it was a cow. This is one of the reactions I heard in this part of the city. And sometimes they get really scared at earthworms, and this frightens me more than anything, that they should be afraid of an earthworm. Another project on the Le Havre plateau. There's an old fort there, the Tourneville Fort. Two successive projects. This Tourneville Fort, 6 hectares in a very poor neighborhood, which cannot be given subsidies because although people are fairly poor there, they do not qualify yet. Because sometimes they own their house, and so there's no help for culture, for investment in this area, in the public areas. And this site, this former military area is a place where we are trying to set up a very big cultural project. It all started the day I was invited. We answered a call for artistic projects to use caravans that had been used during a music festival that's called West Park, and that's going to take place again very soon. The topic was digital art, and we gave the idea of a Henhouse. It was a bit provocative. It was also a reaction to industrial breeding and the way people just wait for the eggs to appear in their plate. And the project was called At Poupoule, the best omelette in the West. You can see it. This is the Henhouse, and so it was a small caravan making tortilla the day of the festival. The second one lasted during the festival, but that one remained here for about 1.5 years. We were able to realize that the animal is really interesting to many people. The hens became a reason to take a walk, to come and get the eggs, and it also displaced the conversation topics in the neighborhood onto something really light-hearted. Coming to look at the hens became something very pleasant to many people. We weren't able to pursue this project because it was artificially imposed in this area. It will come back, but when it comes back, it will be with the participation of the neighbors. The second project is much wider. In the Tourneville Fort, we established a program as open and original as the method to establish it. We're going to start working in a participatory way to have this green island open to all and to give it back to the neighbors, this former military area. This is a north-south angle. The fort is open towards the south, is looking over the estuary, and the north was shut down. And the first thing we did when we decided we would open it up to the population was to open up the wall at the north, but it was not finished. I'm not going to enter into the details of this project. I just show you a number of illustrations we used for the project. On the upper side, you have a big rabbit. It could be the myth of the fort with the games for children. Everything is cross-cutting, art, biodiversity, etc. In the center, there is the concept of edible forest, which we developed. 3.4 hectares of wood, spontaneous woods, fairly low value, where we'd like to add apple trees, raspberry shrubs, and there's another project which has projected a number of fears and attention to have an ovine population, to have sheep and maybe goats. And the neighbors are really interested, the social housing around there. They're interested for the management of the spaces, but they're also interested in the transition of landscape. Nowadays, we don't have we can't have the number of green areas we want with the cutting of the grass because it's too expensive, and maybe the animals can help can cut the grass if the mayor can't do it. To wrap up this, looking after the landscape means to think about tomorrow, think about our kids, think about what makes you feel good, what is beautiful, and help people who live around to also participate in shaping their surroundings.
Marie-Christine Premartin.
Thank you very much. Marie-Christine Premartin. Marie-Christine Premartin. I work for the Environment and Energy Control Agency. The agency works on renewable energies, the circular economy, waste management, sustainable cities in all sorts of different areas. Before I talk about my slide, I'd like to ask you all a question. In your view, what is the carbon impact of the Internet today? Do you have any idea? Well, next slide. In fact, data centers of the web giants are responsible for as many CO2 emissions as civil aviation around the world. That means that what you can't see, what is paperless, also has a major environmental impact. Why am I saying this? It's because we're going to be talking about the habitat at the time of the fourth industrial revolution and the environmental challenges and energy challenges, the use of space, matter, resources. These are all challenges that await us, and one can wonder whether the fourth industrial revolution will help to solve these problems or not. So, we talk about a fourth industrial revolution, a third industrial revolution. It's hard to figure out what this is all about. What is the fourth industrial revolution? The third was digital technology and the internet. The fourth is even more powerful. The fourth, of course, you're familiar, because you're many young people in the room, you're familiar with the idea of the cloud, robots, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, big data, digitization, a lot of changes. And what's specific about the fourth revolution is this connection all over the place and a huge, rapid dissemination of innovation. For example, in 2015, it was estimated that there were 5 billion connected objects in the world. The number will be multiplied by 5 in the space of 5 years. In 2020, there'll be 25 billion connected objects. So just let's think about the impact they'll have. on energy, material, and resources.
Et du coup, cette quatrième révolution
So the
industrielle,
fourth
il faut voir quels
industrial
sont les
revolution, we have to
bénéfices
see
et,
what the
ils sont
benefits
assez
are.
complexes, finalement,
They're
à
quite
évaluer.
complex to
Ça, c'est une
assess.
particularité à l'ADEME.
That's one of the
Effectivement,
specificities of
d'avoir une
ADEME. We always
analyse
try
de cycle de vie, des
to
analyses
analyze
globales,
life cycles, do
des
global
évolutions, et c'est quelque chose qu'il
analyses,
faut
and this is
évidemment
something,
garder en tête.
obviously, you have to bear in
Alors,
mind.
diapo suivante, s'il vous plaît. Finalement, dans le secteur du bâtiment, puisqu'on se rapproche
Building.
du sujet
That
qu'on
brings
avait
me
essayé,
closer to
dans
the
le
subject
secteur
for
du
this
bâtiment,
afternoon.
il va y
In
avoir
building and
un
construction,
bouleversement,
there's
finalement,
going
des
to be
relations
a
entre les
huge
différents acteurs.
upheaval in the relations
D'un
between the
côté,
various
les
players.
entreprises, les entrepreneurs,
Companies,
ils doivent
entrepreneurs
s'adapter,
have to
utiliser
adapt
des outils numériques,
and use digital
la
tools,
maquette numérique,
digital
les
models,
carnets d'entretien du
BEAM,
bâtiment, les passeports
building
rénovation.
maintenance,
Ils sont confrontés aussi à une nouvelle
booklets.
expression des relations
Also,
offre-demande. Donc, ils
supply
doivent
and
mettre en place
demand
des plateformes.
changes. They have to set up
Ils doivent
platforms.
innover pour
They have to innovate
survivre par
in
rapport à
order
des
to
nouveaux
survive
entrants
compared
dans le
with new
domaine,
entrants in
qui
the
sont
area,
Google, qui rachète
like Google
une
buying
entreprise pour faire
a
de l'analyse
company
de données,
which does
Airbnb.
data
Ça,
analysis,
c'est la partie
or
entrepreneur.
Airbnb. So that's the entrepreneur side.
Côté pouvoir public, État,
On
collectivité,
the side of the
les
state,
choses
local
bougent
government,
beaucoup, très
things are
vite.
moving quickly
L'État n'a
too.
pas les moyens, n'a
The
plus les
state
moyens
doesn't
de
anymore
contrôler.
have the means to control things.
Avec évidemment l'ensemble
Yet,
des pouvoirs publics qui essaient d'apporter
with
parfois de
all
la
the
régulation,
powers that
parce
be,
que
there
c'est
has
des
to be some
bouleversements qui
regulation because
changent
these
les
are
chaînes de valeur,
upheavals that change
qui
the
bouleversent
value
les
chain, that
acteurs.
change
On doit aussi apporter
the
des
players.
réponses aux demandes de
Also,
mise
it's
à disposition des
necessary
données publiques.
to
Pourquoi faire
respond
Quels
to
sont, comment on
requests
protège aussi,
for public
évidemment,
data,
les libertés
what you need to
individuelles.
protect. You need to respect individual freedoms.
Les citoyens,
And then we
les
citizens,
citoyens, on a de plus en plus
well, we citizens
de possibilités,
have more and
on a
more possibilities,
plus de pouvoir,
more and more
et le
power.
numérique nous apporte pas mal
Digital
de
technologies give us quite a lot of possibilities.
Être des plus consacrer des choses les plus égoïstes ou les plus altruistes.
Things can be totally egoistic or very altruistic. We hope a positive economy will develop. It's possible to create communities, social networks. One can oppose projects and also propose projects and invent new solutions, like participatory habitat or other forms of mobility. So we talk about empowerment, the empowerment of citizens. In other words, this is a wonderful change. But you have to bear in mind the fact that there's no point designing low-energy buildings or having lots of connected objects or sensors which adapt all by themselves if users don't know how to use them or don't want to use them. So the fourth industrial revolution has to take account of the human factor, which must stand at the core, at the heart of all this. ADEME's vision of housing in 2050. I'll be really old, but you'll be just middle-aged. You have to take account of the aging of the population. At present, in 2005, the over 60s represented 1 out of 5 people. By 2050, it'll be 1 out of 3. We hope we'll age better, that we'll be fitter, but this will create new needs for different services and a suitable habitat. There's another change. There'll be change in the family unit. The traditional family is maybe a bit outmoded. You now have single-parent families, families with a variable geometry, and the housing will have to adapt too and may need to change over time. And then there's the last topic, the economic crisis. Oh, there are all sorts of changes. The economic crisis seems here to stay for a while. People live a more precarious existence. There's a lot of unemployment. I hope, of course, that it will be reduced, but there is a change in the economic world which has been really turned topsy-turvy.
il y a la précarité énergétique dans le logement.
There's the issue of energy in housing. 1 out of 5 families
ou déjà en précarité énergétique, donc c'est quand même des sujets
is on a shaky footing when it comes to accessing energy, paying for electricity. So what about the housing in 2020? So what's all this going to look like in 2050? Do you think things will look like that? Really futuristic buildings? Will we live in a Star Trek-like habitat? That's science fiction. At ADEME, we don't think things will really look like that. Of course, there will be upheavals, but they'll be probably less visible. Of course, buildings will be less futuristic, but there will be changes which are very major. First of all, buildings will be constructed according to the standards of a responsible building. We have positive energy buildings. That means you need to optimize energy consumption, and these buildings produce more energy than they use. So that means we'll be able to redistribute this surplus energy to others. Buildings will be connected to intelligent electricity grids. Buildings will probably be modular. Biosource materials will be used. One of the major challenges, which our American colleague referred to, will be the issue of heating and cooling. To use little energy, we'll have to use natural ventilation, things like that. We'll have to try and optimize cooling of buildings and cities, and that will be very important, as mentioned. Planting will be used. We'll probably have buildings with more plants on the roofs and on the walls. I'm not sure there'll be that many farms, but that's another issue. But in any event, there will be major changes, and the foundations will have to take account of the issue of stability. There are a number of places where there will be problems owing to global warming, which will affect the clay foundations. We'll have to have buildings suited to climate change. And then inside, it will be even more possible to use a certain number of tools. As I said, there will be a lack of space in general, so there will be more collective buildings and shared places. This is already being done. I talked about participatory habitats, places where people will share their washing machine, their dryer, all sorts of ultra-modern equipment. This will save space in the individual housing units, because people may do more work from home, maybe part-time. They'll work from home, so they'll need space. Maybe there'll be mobile partitions so that housing can adapt to the number of people in the family living there. There'll be shared gardens. Thanks to new tools, we can hope there will be more cooperation with one's neighbors living right next door or just a bit further away. So a lot of technological innovations, new uses. That is our vision of the habitat by 2050. Why are we interested in all these topics at ADEME? Why do we conduct this kind of study and research work on scenarios and trends leading us up to 2050? We want to be able to inform politicians about public policy regulations that apply to buildings. We need to support certain technological innovations, social innovations. The concern being, are we going in the right direction? Are things compatible with climate change? To phrase things differently, will the fourth industrial revolution enable housing in 2050 to be weather compatible? Thank you. Thank you very much. In terms of organization, we're going to give the floor to Olivier. We're the last round table. So we have to move quickly.
Ils ne veulent pas rester aux questions-réponses.
If you don't want to stay for the Q&A,
Vous ne partirez pas entre-temps, ce sera plus correct pour nos invités et moins...
please leave at the appropriate time. That would be more polite for our speakers.
Qui veulent partir, et puis on se fait des questions-réponses.
We'll give the floor to Laurent, then those who want to leave can leave, and then we'll have a short Q&A. Laurent Perrozet, I'm an architect at AIA. You may be familiar with this building at the entrance to Le Havre. It was inaugurated recently, and this helps me to explain what architects can do when designing an integrated building. We are architects working interested in health. We build a lot of clinics and hospitals. We also are interested in the environment in general, the public buildings, and hence, as architects, we have given thought to many environmental issues like the impact we have on the planet, major issues today, and we as contractors, what responsibility do we have in all these areas? We have a foundation. Last June, we organized a symposium on these matters, focusing on architecture, health, and the environment. There are three main issues pertaining to the environment. What impact do we have on the existing context? There's the human and social dimension. We want to incorporate the human dimension in health facilities, and then architecture. How can we improve the general usage of buildings? We want to ensure that all these questions are taken into account and the answer is consistent. We have a method, like in HQE, we comply with the label for sustainable buildings. We have to take account of all these very pressing issues. You have to take account of impact. You have to address all the issues pertaining to the building of a given entity. Buildings have an impact on our carbon footprint and on pollution to a large extent. So we really have to be aware of this impact, and we have to take out of all the different scales and levels at which we can act as contractors. So, of course, we think about the environmental issues and the way you can integrate a building in a given context, because you have the actual built-up area and then the human dimension. Of course, we build homes, shelters, which are like an envelope. And we can really control all the various parameters, but the characteristics are very diverse depending on the climate, the place, the type of construction. So you have to be very careful about all that. Energy, of course, we're fortunate because we live in a temperate climate here in France. The issue of energy is very important. It's perhaps less important than elsewhere, where the climate is more aggressive in the north or the south, but you have to manage the energy. This is energy we need to live comfortably in our habitat. And the last issue is quite a complex one, and I don't think I'll dwell on it. We have a carbon footprint. What is the impact we have when we build a building? And we need to weigh up the needs. We talked about the internet earlier on. The impact of the internet is huge. But in terms of a building, the choice of materials, for example, has a huge impact on carbon footprint. The figures are rather abstract, but systematically, we want to ensure that everyone realizes that these choices have an impact on our environment, our shared environment. There's an impact on our health, individual health, but the health of society in general. ENSM was an amazing experience. It's a a flagship building in Le Havre. It's the shipping school, the Navy school rather. The idea is to reinforce the relationship between the city, the port, and the sea. It's an atypical program. It already existed in Le Havre. The school was in the higher reaches of Le Havre, and the town hall and others decided to relocate it in the port. Port Marion is a beautiful place. It comprises, there's a lot of wind. In Le Havre, we're on the seaside, there's a lot of wind, there's rain, there's the light. In these areas, the light is different. The light's different in the port and in the city because of the way the light's reflected on the water. And there's a link with history, too. It's what I was saying earlier on. This school was an opportunity to reconcile Le Havre with its port and its historic culture. Le Havre was built nearly 500 years ago. In 2017, we'll celebrate the 500th anniversary of Le Havre. It was created by François I, and it was designed to be the port of Paris. And history evolved over time. The port became economically extremely important in some periods of history. It totally hid the city. The link between the city and the port itself was quite complex at times. And above all, the port covered a huge area. I'm sure you've seen how big the city is. So, locating the school in the port and in part of reconstructed Le Havre was designed to recreate this strong link between this iconic building and the city. You've all heard of Duperret, the architect. As Marion said earlier on, I think Le Havre, we're fortunate to live in a very beautiful city. It was rebuilt with a lot of redeeming features. The Le Perret areas contributed a lot to modernity. When you think about projects in Paris like the Île aux Verts and others, you already had that kind of thing here with Perret. He built green areas in all the southern parts of the city, not far from Saint-Joseph, for example. It's a very modern city, a city where Perret anticipated a lot of things. He factored in the human dimension. Nature is very present, and this is very important, I think. I believe that the city is an iconic one. I boast its merits. Quite some time ago, we worked on the maternity ward in Le Havre, and it's a city where it's very pleasant to live. The more the city takes over the port area and establishes a strong link with the port, the more I think the city will be pleasant in the future. Indeed, the port is a magical area. When you think about all the examples of cities in the north, Copenhagen, Rotterdam, and so on, these are areas where young people love to move in. And these old port areas end up being very lively. But this is not really the topic for this afternoon. ENSM, the idea was to reestablish the link between the historic, the rebuilt city and the port, and also in terms of the program itself, the idea was to train people for the Navy. How can these naval students be, while being in the middle of the city, how can they be led to believe that they're on the high seas? This very simple relationship existed. We were on a big wharf, so we proposed the wharf and this former warehouse here. And this relationship is a simple one. The relationship is between water and the sky. When you're on the sea, on a ship, you're surrounded by the elements. You have the water below and the sky above. We imagined this relationship And physically, we wanted to reconstruct the link between the water and the sky. And we knew, therefore, that the project would be meaningful for the naval school. And so you go up ramps from the wharf. We wanted the school to have a view of the port and the city. We wanted the building to be part of this very special context. So, of course, physically, you had to see things and sense them. And then once you go into the area and see the port, you go up a big staircase which takes you up to the terrace, the upper bridge, which is a place where you can see this relationship with the estuary, and you can see this physical link. You can see this link, which I think is absolutely essential, because it was the very wherewithal for this educational project. It's more than just an educational project, in fact. So we wanted this project to include everything you find on a ship. We decided there would be no false ceilings. We didn't think there was any need to use useless materials. We realized that the technical side was important. These are engineering students. We wanted them to find all the same plumbing, the techniques, all these things which they would find on a ship. That was part of the teaching program. I think we had to reconfigure things, and there are other facilities which are hyper-connected tools. They're quite incredible, because we're talking about a very virtual world here. The idea is to teach everything about a ship. It could be a huge container ship, for example, and they have all sorts of simulation tools which make it possible for the students to learn how to pilot a ship, get the ship into the port of Singapore. There are all sorts of parameters concerned, not only in terms of the actual navigating, but also the production of energy to get the ship to move forward. So you can see the simulation here, the bridge. There's a machine room where we simulate the smell, the sound of the engine, so that students really feel they're on a ship. In the machine room, there are quite a lot of connected tools and interfaces. It's a fascinating technology. The idea is to make the students feel they're really on a ship, so that in the future they can be captains of a ship in a port or on the high seas. We worked on the envelope too. We paid special attention to that because we were in Le Havre.
On avait la chance de ne pas forcément subir les assauts du soleil tous les jours de l'année, mais par contre,
we wanted to factor in the idea of the sun, but the casing also needed to be very specific. It had to make people think of a ship. We thought of something fairly opaque, a micro-perforated shell or envelope. Then there's a rock wool sort of lining, which is very effective and which stops energy from being lost. So it's very easy to heat the building. So in a nutshell, if you compare the building in terms of energy with all of the thermal regulations, the level is very high. We produce more energy, usually, apart from the least good months, mid-December to mid-February. That's 2 months a year. There we can't produce enough energy. The roof, 3/4 of the roof is covered with solar panels. That enables us to produce energy. And in addition, as you'll see later on, there's a part which is underwater, we can heat and cool the building. Here you have the solar panels on the roof. We can produce excess energy. This energy is redistributed, of course, locally. We would have liked to be able to store it because for we as architects, for ADEME and everyone, it's important to store energy. We know how to produce energy in buildings, but we're trying to figure out how to store this energy in the form of compressed air, for example, but this is just on the drawing board, and we want to try to concentrate the energy and then sort of use it in the form of compressed air. There are other systems for storing energy. We know that in the future, almost all buildings will be able to store energy, create their own energy. The energy is currently injected into the grid for others, but in the future, we'll be able to store it in the building. And we've imagined all sorts of systems so that in the future, we can store the energy built up over the summer so that it can be used during the coldest months of the winter. So the building becomes really energy positive and doesn't consume anything more than it uses. Second device, we have these sensors. This is totally underwater. We don't have to overly heat the water in the winter, and in the summer the water temperature can be brought down to cool the building. The idea being to reduce expenditure on energy. So all our know-how is used to figure out the best means. Each program is different. In a private home, the issues are different. This is a public building. But the solutions found can be then redeployed elsewhere. The idea being to reduce energy consumption for maintenance. Next slide. I just wanted to say that the carbon impact of a building is important. All materials are used have a carbon label. The take-home message here is that with the ENSM, compared with similar buildings of a similar size, we have an impact that is 3 times less because everybody did their best. Everybody tried to reduce the impact on the environment, and the idea was to have a building which would have the lowest possible impact. So thank you very much for your attention. The interpreter would like to mention that there will be no translation during the question and answer session. Thank you. So those who want to leave can now do so.
Ça sera le verdict. Alors, s'ils s'en vont tous ou pas? C'est ça, sur votre papier.
Là, on va relancer un appel à projet. Là, on investissement dans l'aide à l'étude pour la nouvelle réglementation carbone.
J'ai laissé la diapositive parce que c'était simplement une échelle, mais quand je me suis fait expliquer le sujet, tout est possible. Et c'est il n'y a pas de règle, il n'y a pas de règle précise.
On va se prendre vraiment 5 minutes de questions, pas plus, hein, parce qu'il y a conclusion derrière. Je vous demanderai des questions assez courtes, parce qu'il faut que je les reformule après pour le micro, pour qu'elles soient enregistrées. Voilà. Sauf si le micro est assez long, monsieur.
Alors, monsieur l'architecte parlait de la construction de son école, l'emplacement où il y avait du vent. Qui dit vent dit ventilation, la ventilation naturelle. La ventilation naturelle, on a complètement oublié de l'utiliser. Et bon, là, c'est peut-être pas l'endroit idéal pour ce genre de choses. Mais bon, il faut penser à la ventilation naturelle.
La ventilation naturelle, donc.
Oui, non, mais c'est
micro.
Hop.
C'est vrai que j'aurais pu vous en parler, mais c'est un bâtiment bioclimatique. En définitive, l'escalier, tout le dispositif de l'escalier central ventile l'ensemble du bâtiment. C'est-à-dire que c'est ni plus ni moins qu'un grand puits. Comme toutes les circulations s'ouvrent dessus, c'est tout simple. Il y a un apport naturel qui se fait par les façades. Et ensuite, il y a une extraction qui se fait par le centre du bâtiment. Et justement, on bénéficie de ce puits comme une cheminée, pratiquement, pour ventiler l'ensemble du bâtiment. C'est vrai que je n'ai pas mis une coupe, mais c'est le cas.
Et si je peux me permettre pour rajouter, vous avez raison, cet enjeu-là extrêmement important et on soutient des projets notamment dans les DOM pour travailler le plus possible sur la ventilation naturelle pour éviter, ce que je disais tout à l'heure, le recours à de la climatisation avec des climatiseurs qui sont très consommateurs d'énergie. Donc là, c'est vraiment des choses qui se font de plus en plus, une réflexion sur la ventilation naturelle des bâtiments pour l'optimiser et essayer de le plus possible l'utiliser. Et puis il y a la question aussi près de la ventilation dans les villes et des orientations des bâtiments aussi pour essayer de...
Évidemment, confort, oui, exactement. Et de santé.
Une autre question? C'était la seule question.
J'ai malheureusement pas assisté au début de Marion. Ah, ça peut être ça, super passionnant.
Eh bien, c'était la question symbolique. Merci. On peut remercier nos intervenants. Merci de ces interventions passionnantes, denses mais passionnantes.